Hello and good day. My name is Terrie Lambert and I'm presenting a couple of studies today that were first given in Fiji in late March, early April. The Islands of the Sea Ministry held their annual camp meeting and TMW together with Elder Parminda visited the island, and because of inclement weather, there were slow upload speeds, we were unable to Zoom or record meetings. So the thoughts that I shared during that camp, I'm recording today to put to the movement for consideration. These are just my thoughts. They are not movement position, and I just invite discussion and feedback. So my thoughts today are on the Sunday law. So let's begin with prayer. Our loving God in heaven, we know the prophets looked down to this time and desired to live in these days. And yet here we are, a very privileged people, and we are grateful too, but we pray for your guidance. Help us to use the tools that you gave us wisely and to understand the time we're living in and what tomorrow holds. So make us ready for your glory. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So we'll start today with a short review of Acts 27, and I've drawn the lines on the whiteboard above. Acts 27 is a parable in two parts. Now, it's a story of two ships, the two ships that take two journeys that give us two lines. And we understand this story in Acts 27 to be a parable in two parts. So when we think of parables, our go-to passage is Matthew 13, verse 34 and 35. All these things spake Jesus unto the multitude in parables, and without a parable spake he not unto them. Matthew 13 actually contains 8 parables, and they all are illustrations of the kingdom of heaven. But the first 7 is a little different to the last one, number 8. The last parable is about the teachings of the kingdom of heaven. So we understand the kingdom of heaven to be this movement, and parable number 8 are how the teachings of this movement are taught. So Matthew 13 verse 52 says, Then he said unto them, Therefore every scribe which is instructed unto the kingdom of heaven is like unto a person that is an householder, which bringeth forth out of their treasure things new and old. So we know that the teachings of the movement of the kingdom of heaven come in 2 parts, and those 2 parts form a whole. They are things new and old. And when we look at these 2 lines, it very much illustrates that principle. The first line begins at the time of the end, 1989, and they're things new. What happens at the time of the end is the book of Daniel is unsealed. And what is unsealed? Chapters 11 and 12. And then our second line is things old. It's the time of the end, so the book of Daniel is unsealed. And what's old? Daniel's chapter 8 and 9. So every scribe that is instructed under the kingdom of heaven needs to bring these 2 teachings of Daniel together. So our things new and old. So we must never forget that the time of the end is the unsealing of the book of Daniel, and that unsealing takes us right through to the end of the line. So Acts 27, things new and old, agrees with the principle of Matthew 13:52. When these 2 lines are compared, we see they represent the same thing, the institutions of the United States and Adventism. One ship or one line, the ship of Adramyttium, gives us an ugly picture of a bad ship. Adramyttium means abide in death. So it is dead. It had the opportunity to come alive at the time of the end, but it chose to abide in its current condition. This line takes us from 1989 through to the midnight cry or Panium, and then we see its progressive overturning leading up to the Sunday law. Then we come to our second line, second ship, the ship of Alexandria, a protector or defender of the people. And this line takes us back to 1798 and the story of how these institutions were raised up to protect and to defend God's people. But in the middle of the Civil War, 1863, nidus, they go off course and they never go back to their original plan. 1989, going back to the first line, we see that this is the repeat of the parable of the 10 virgins. It's the story of the wise. Paul tells the people on the ship that they're in danger, and if they continue on the course that they want to take, that their lives will be in danger. His warnings are ignored in Caesarea, and they're also ignored here on the second ship in Lycia. Because it's 1989 and everybody's happy. There's a south wind blowing, and south winds they blow softly. They're gentle winds. There's nothing restraining them anymore. But they should also have been a forewarning of the winds, the east wind that was to blow after it. They should have expected the east wind to follow. The east wind, we see at Euroclydon, and we understand that to be the arrival of radical Islam in history. The east wind is a tempestuous wind. The east wind strikes the boat and the boards begin to come apart. The timbers are groaning, Ellen White says, and the ship leaks. The threat is that the ship is going to be flooded with water. So what is going to restrain the ship from being flooded? We know that they have to undergird the ship, and we understand that to be line upon line. Rope upon rope. It's going to pull those boards together, keep the ship intact. So just note here that what stops flooding is the line upon line. What keeps the people safe is those lines or those ropes restraining the flooding. We come to Raphia, and where Paul is given a message, a warning begins for the boat that it's going to be shipwrecked. Then on the 14th night at midnight, they can see that shipwreck or the shore visibly ahead, and time is introduced. Acts 27:27. I've got the midnight cry there, but you could put midnight. What happens at midnight? There's a cry out. They're crying out that shipwreck is visibly ahead, that the ship or the institutions will be shipwrecked. It's at this time that the soldiers cut the lines. So the flooding is inevitable. They've been dropping anchor and measuring how close they are to shore. They know they're getting closer, and so they're going to wait until morning until they finally hit the shore and shipwreck is accomplished. So between the cry at midnight and the morning or shipwreck, what important information is Luke going to open up to us? In Acts 27:37, we're told that there are 276 souls aboard upon the ship. What would ordinarily be seen as a bit of random information is going to open up to us a universe of knowledge. So we're going to take 3 people out of that number, Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus, and we're left with 273. 273 what? 273 Levites, or the second group on the boat. So 2 groups on the boat, and then 1 group, the Nethinims, are on the shore. That second group, we go to Numbers 3. We understand that at the beginning of ancient Israel, there were 273, too few Levites to make up the number that was needed. And at the end of modern Israel, that number will be made up. So 273 being the number we assign to the Levites. So that's one thing that we do with that number. It gives us information about the Levites. but we continue to use that number as a symbol, and we go to 273 BC, and that's the history of Daniel 11, verse 4, the breakup of Alexander the Great's kingdom, the breakup of Greece. Alexander the Great dies, and this is going to take us back into that history, and we see the complexity of that history is going to give us more information about our time. So 273 BC. And I'll draw the line a bit bigger here. What happens in 273 BC? Well, we note 275 BC as the Battle of Beneventum. Which is also a battle of, we note as the Battle of Panium. So we can also note the Battle of Beneventum there, 275 BC. So this is when the Romans soundly defeat Pyrrhus and his allies and drive him out of Italy. So we've gone back into the history of Pyrrhus. We're seeing the development of our 4 generals with the defeat of Pyrrhus. And yes, it just fills in that history of the breakup of Greece. So the Romans defeat Pyrrhus, they drive him out of Italy, and the world starts to take notice of Rome. This date marks the arrival of Rome on the world stage. So I'll share screen and we'll read a familiar quote. What launches Rome onto the world stage is the Pyrrhic War of 280 to 275 BC. Gary Forsyth, in his book A Critical History of Early Rome from Prehistory to the First Punic War, says this: Rome's defeat of Pyrrhus was a clear declaration to the rest of the ancient Mediterranean world that the Romans had arrived on the world scene of warfare and power politics, and recognition of this fact was no long time in coming. In 273 BC, King Ptolemy II Philadelphus of Egypt sent ambassadors to Rome to open up friendly diplomatic relations with the victor of Italy. The Romans reciprocated by sending their own ambassadors to Egypt, Q. Fabius Maximus Gurges, N. Fabius Pictor, and Q. Ulganius Gallus. This delegation to Egypt, however, must have been headed by Gurges, who had been twice consul, censor, triumphator, and was perhaps the princeps senatus at the time of the embassy. The Pyrrhic War finally came to an end in 272 BC when Tarentum surrendered to Rome and joined many other Italian states in becoming a Roman ally. And that is from A Critical History of Early Rome, Gary Forsyth. And so we note 275 BC as Rome defeating Pyrrhus. He is driven out of Italy. 273 BC is Egypt sends a delegation to Rome. And then 272 BC, Rome sends a delegation to Egypt. We know that Pyrrhus, first we note, we'll note the Battle of Argos. Pyrrhus dies. Spelled that wrong. And we note the delegation that goes to Egypt, Quintus Fabius Maximus, Gurges. So we mark 275 BC, it's 2021. Battle of Beneventum, Battle of Panium also, and 275 BC. In previous studies, it has been noted that 273 is marked by July 24, 2022. We call that an increase of knowledge. And the event is Dobbs versus Women's Health Organization, and the name escapes me. Sorry. Brain freeze. It'll come to me. So we note that the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And then we come down, we note this as Sunday law. And we also note that Tarentum falls here at 272. Pyrrhus is driven out of the Italian peninsula in 275 BC, but he does leave a battalion in Tarentum. It takes until 272 for that Tarentum to fall, and Rome has full control of the peninsula. So Rome wins. Ptolemy II of Egypt establishes diplomatic relations and friendship with Rome, and then Rome returns the favour. So why do we attach this name here to Sunday law or shipwreck? Is we took these names here, Maximus, Gurges, as maximum flood. Why is it, Gurges means to swell like a whirlpool, swallow up like a flood. Why is it that we associate flood with the Sunday law? So we know a Sunday law is Daniel 11 verse 41. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many shall be overthrown. So that verse itself doesn't mention a flood, but it does mention that the many will be overthrown. So we put the two together and we understand that the many will be overflown by a flood. But why do we associate flood with the Sunday law? So there are two prophetic references that I'd like to review quickly. We'll go to Daniel chapter 9 and Revelation chapter 12. And I'll just grab my Bible. Okay, so quick review of Daniel. So I understand that Daniel had his first vision in chapter 7. Daniel chapter 2 is Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Daniel 7 is he has the vision of the four prophetic kingdoms, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And the question that he has about this vision is he wants to understand the truth of the fourth beast. So it's that fourth beast that intrigues him. He can understand the lion and the bear, he can see them. But it's the fourth beast that he wants more of an explanation. That's Daniel 7. When he has the vision of Daniel 8 and he gets to the end of Daniel 8, it's the conversation that Christ has with Gabriel about the days. It's the timing that he doesn't understand. So he wants to understand time and he wants to understand the truth of the fourth beast. So at the end of Daniel 8, because he doesn't understand, he's sick. And what does that represent? It represents the Laodicean condition. The reason he doesn't understand is because he's Laodicean. We know from Isaiah chapter 1 that the sickness, Laodicea, is represented by this great sickness, this disease from the top of the head to the toes of the feet. And Daniel is very much a part of that body, and he is just as much Laodicean as all the rest of them. So what's he going to do to come out of the Laodicean condition? What does he do in Daniel chapter 9? And don't say he prays. He doesn't pray, although I'm sure he does, but he studies. He goes to the books, plural. So he goes to the book of Jeremiah because he tells us and he understands the 70 weeks. And he goes to the book of Leviticus because he will quote it in his prayer. And he gets an understanding of why the 70 weeks. So once he gets that knowledge, he now has to pray the prayer of Leviticus 26 to bring him out of that Laodicean condition, to lift that curse, to acknowledge that he is just as much a part of the problem as everybody else. We have sinned. We have done wickedly. Once he has done that, then Gabriel can come and give him an increase of knowledge. He will give him skill to understand. And what does he want to understand? The truth of the fourth beast and the time, the 2300 days, the time prophecy. And so what he is given is a starting point. So if you're in Daniel chapter 9, what Gabriel will give him is from the going forth of the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. So we're given 457 BC. So that's our starting point. And we are in verse 25. So once he has that starting point, then he can know the 70 weeks. So 70 weeks are going to take him to 34 AD. So I'm just going through the information that Daniel 9 is going to give Daniel. 34 AD is the 70 weeks. It says, verse 25, from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So that's 69 weeks, which takes us to 27 AD. That's the 69 weeks, which gives us a week to go. The street shall be built again and the wall even in troublous times. Well, that took 7 years. So there's our 7 and there's our 62. 7 is the street and the wall being finished, and the 62 is the remainder to take us to 69, as it will say there in 26, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. So the key word there is after. After 62 weeks. So after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off. So we know that after that, he's going to be cut off, but we don't know exactly when yet. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So who's the prince? The prince is Titus. Who's the people? That's his army. They come and destroy the city and the sanctuary in 70 AD. And the end thereof shall be with a flood. The end of pagan Rome destroying the city and the sanctuary shall be with a flood. We note that as 538. And this is the flood. And then it says, and unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. So there are desolations at the end of the war. The end of the war is 1798. And we see desolations. And then that history is going to be repeated in verse 27. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So here's our 1 week, 7 years. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So that the midst of the week is 31. That's the after 27, when Messiah is cut off, is 31. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate. So what are the abominations that are going to cause the city and the sanctuary to be desolated? It's the continuing of the sacrifices in the temple and in Jerusalem after the death of the Messiah. So that all should have finished in 31 AD. Type meant antitype. But because Christ was rejected, it's going to continue on. Because of those abominations, Rome and their armies are going to destroy the city and the sanctuary in 70 AD. It's the consequences of the continuation of the sanctuary work and the cutting off of the Messiah. So they're the abominations, for the overspreading of abominations, or if you've got a marginal reference, with the abominable armies. So the abominable armies are the armies of Rome, are going to bring punishment on Jerusalem for their abominations, even until the consummation. So Rome and their armies are going to continue to desolate even until the consummation. What's the consummation? What does it mean to consummate something? You consummate a marriage when husband and wife, or the two partners, sleep with each other. So the consummation is this flood here in 538. Pagan Rome does its work with its abominable armies up until 538. This consummation is what we understand to be church and state. It's that marriage. And that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So a marginal reference makes it much easier for me. It says, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolator. So basically what goes around comes around. So the desolating power gets desolated. So what's the desolating power here? It's the papacy, and it gets desolated in 1798. So again, we see desolations at the end. So what we want to note here is that we want to note that there is a flood here in 538. It's also known as a consummation, with coming together of church and state. Now, 538 really is, we know that in 533, Justinian decrees that the Pope of Rome is the head of all churches and the corrector of heretics. So the Pope of Rome has been given authority, and it has been given, already had power. But in 538, what Justinian is going to do at the Council of Orleans is he's going to reaffirm the Sunday law of Constantine. So the Constantine Sunday law was 321. That gets reaffirmed here in 538. So we can mark a Sunday law here. And basically it's Constantine's Sunday law with a few amendments that now you can travel and you can cook and you can clean on a Sunday, but essentially it's still a Sunday law. So what this marks is a transition from the pagan Roman Empire to the Holy Roman Empire. And another name of that theologians use is Caesaro-papalism. And the person at the center of that is actually not the Pope, it's Justinian. Justinian has done a lot a lot with the Roman laws, and he's going to use those Roman laws now to enforce and persecute those that aren't agreeing with his theology. So this actually marks where Justinian changes from not just being a head of state, but he now sees himself as a theologian. And he's actually even going to study and write papers on the nature of Christ and things like that. So 538 not only marks a change in the kingdom, it marks a change in the king. And the king is Justinian. So it's this flood here. It's a flood of laws, which includes the Sunday law, and yes, this combination of church and state. And this is what will sweep away God's church unless it flees into the wilderness. So it's going to flee into the wilderness here for safety. Going to go into hiding. So let's go to Romans chapter 12. What did I say? To Revelation chapter 12. So Revelation 12 is the history of the Christian church. Begins with a symbol of a woman. Now we understand that these symbols are not ideal symbols. They are patriarchal symbols. There's a reason why the church is represented as a woman. She's the weaker vessel. She doesn't have the power of the state. So we're just going to talk about the church here and not the woman. So the church here is represented in with the feet standing on the moon and the sun behind its head. And the church is going to have a baby, and that baby is the Christ child. This is the birth of Christ 4 BC. The child gets caught into heaven, and the dragon power, the Roman power, the power that Daniel wanted to understand is now going to persecute the church. It wanted to kill the man-child, wanted to kill the Christ, but Christ is escaped. Christ has gone to heaven, can no longer touch Christ, has to focus on the church. The church is going to go into the wilderness for 1260 years. We want to go to the end of that 1260 years. So let's go to verse 15. And the serpent cast out of its mouth water as a flood after the church, that it might cause the church to be carried away of the flood. So this serpent now has changed form. We understand that in a primary sense, the serpent or the dragon represents Satan, but in a secondary sense, it represents pagan Rome. Pagan Rome is also going to transition from pagan Rome to papal Rome. We're at the end of the 1260 years, and we have papal Rome here that is going to cast out of its mouth water as a flood. This is at the end of the 1260. So I'm just going to write a flood here. What's this flood designed to do? To flush out the church and to destroy it. Remember the church has been in hiding. So what is this flood at the end of the 1260? So if you were to read Smith or Haskell, they'll tell you that the earth that protects the church here, the earth in verse 16, and the earth helped the church. So the earth that helps the church is the Reformation. But Jones will tell you to understand that earth, you've got to go to Revelation chapter 13. And what is the earth in Revelation 13? It's the United States. So we're going to agree with Jones, who's going to say the earth is the United States. And the church has to leave the old world for the new world. It has to escape and go to another continent where it can have freedom of religion in order to survive. So what was the flood then that the papacy is going to use to try and destroy the church? It is the Counter-Reformation. So with the Reformation, we're all familiar with that. The church was, the papacy was held accountable for its corruption and its errors. With the Counter-Reformation, what the papacy is going to attempt to do is act on those accusations. So they actually take a lot on board, and they want to clean up their act. So they have the Council of Trent that runs over many years. I think there's 3 councils in which they attempt to clean up the corruptions. They do away with, say, the indulgences that Luther didn't like. They decide to open up seminaries where all the priests will get taught the same thing. They try and clean up the corruptions, the monetary corruptions, and all those things that are happening within the church. But as far as doctrine goes, they want to double down on their doctrine. They're not going to give up on those beliefs. And so in order to do that, again, they get involved with education, opening up schools and getting teachers into already existing schools. So they're going to flood the school system in Europe with teachings that will double down on their beliefs. And this is the flood that was going to put the church in the wilderness in danger. It's a flood of teachings, a flood of methodologies even. They had to counteract what the Reformation was saying about them, because there were many people before there were Adventists who understood the 1260 days and the 1798 that pointed out that it was going to come to who it was in Bible prophecy. So there were, those teachings were around before there were Adventists. So we see methods such as futurism, putting the prophecy in the future, preterism, saying it all happened in the past, and also spiritualism, the teachings of Ignatius Loyola, and just, don't forget about prophecy. All you need is a relationship. We hear that today in the mainstream church teaches that. Don't worry about prophecy. You just have to have that relationship with God. That's nothing new, really. So there are all these teachings designed to destroy God's church in the wilderness. So that's the flood at the end of the 1260. We see a flood at the beginning, which involved laws, but also doctrine and teachings. And we also see these flood of teachings, information at the end of the 1260. And we know from our lines what keeps us safe from any flood is the lines, is the girding of the ship, to stop that flood of information coming and sweeping away or overthrowing God's people. So that's just a little look at the floods that we get from Daniel and Revelation. So 538, as one theologian put it, it's the metamorphosis of Justinian from chief of staff to theologian, or the transition from the pagan Roman Empire to the Holy Roman Empire. Caesaro-papism. So we'll talk a bit more about Caesar later. Combination of social and political power of secular government with religious power. So Maximus Gurgis, maximum flood. But we want to have a look at his full name. And to understand his full name, we need to understand Roman nomenclature, how the Romans used names, how they made their names. So let's write the full name up here. So it's Q, the Q stands for Quintus. Then there's Fabius, Maximus, Gerges. In Roman nomenclature, Quintus is his prenomen. That means it's his first name, his personal name. Fabius is his nomen, which we would say is a surname. Maximus Gerges is cognomen. We could call that a nickname, but sometimes it's because a nickname is a describing name. So it could be a family description. I'll explain that more. So prenomen, first name or your given name. I'll just write that up. Given name, personal name. This is, I'll write it here, Roman nomenclature. So we understand Maximus Gerges, maximum flood. He was given that name because in his youth, it was said that he led a dissolute youth. He had gluttonous habits in which he consumed every luxury he came across. But when he embarked on his public career, he put aside the things of his youth and his indulged lifestyle and cultivated a more somber attitude. So the story goes. So he received the name Maximus Gerges from the way he behaved when he was young. So like I said, it's a nickname. It can also identify a particular branch within a family. So Fabius is his nomen or his surname. Now, the nomen is the most important part of your name. It is your clan name. It distinguished what broad group you belonged to. So if we looked at the name, if you think of Julius Caesar as an example, his full name was Gaius Julius Caesar. So his prenomen, his first name was Gaius. His surname, his clan or tribe name, or sometimes they called it gens. Just write that there, if you see that word. Can be tribe or clan. His tribe clan was Julii, and Caesar was a cognomen. We'll talk more about that later. So your nomen really was the most important part of your name. The Julii, Julius Caesar, they trace their origins to the origins of Rome, claiming descent from Venus. It symbolizes the power of your name. So like Julius Caesar, he was born poor, but it didn't matter because he was part of the Julii clan, and that meant something. So your nomen would give you your authority. It was about who your family was. It wasn't just you, it was who you were. You were a Julii or you were a Fabii. Everything you did added or detracted from your name. So we know what Maximus Gerges means. What does Fabius mean? It means Faber or fava, or as we understand them, or I do, broad beans. Fabius, bean farmer. But the fava and broad beans. Fava beans, known in much of the world as broad beans, are one of the oldest domesticated crops. Globally, it's the third most important feed grain legume. Currently, 58 countries produce this bean on large scale. Fava beans are one of the best performing crops under global warming and climate change scenarios because of its unique ability to excel under almost all types of climatic conditions, coupled with its wide adaptability to ranges of soil environments. In ancient Greece and Rome, beans were used in voting. A white bean being used to cast a yes vote and a black bean for no. So if I say the name Pythagoras, you might be familiar with him. If you think back to primary school math, Pythagoras was a famous Greek mathematician, philosopher, and also a very strange cult leader. Very odd person, Pythagoras. He led a cult, and his disciples were told to abstain from beans. They were not allowed to have beans. And Aristotle tells us the reason for that is because it was a political protest against democracy. Pythagoras didn't like democracy. The Pythagoreans believed in oligarchy. So as a political protest, they didn't eat beans. So beans were very much connected with voting and democracy. Because of their shape, they were also thought to represent the souls of dead people. So there were some people that wouldn't eat broad beans because they thought they were eating the souls of dead people. Traditionally, you planted them on November the 2nd in the Northern Hemisphere. So November 1, so in Catholicism, November is the month of prayer. It starts with November 1, which is All Saints' Day. You pray for all the dead in heaven. November 2 is All Souls' Day. You pray for all the dead in purgatory. So if you think back to the Lisbon earthquake, all the people are in church November 1 because it's All Saints' Day. On All Souls' Day, they're meant to go out and plant their fava beans, which they never got to do because of the earthquake. So just like here in Australia in the Southern Hemisphere on St. Patrick's Day, you go out and you plant your sweet peas. It's just one of those traditions. In the Northern Hemisphere, November 2, November is the month of prayer, the month of, for Catholicism. November 2 is All Souls' Day, you plant your fava beans. That's just a matter of interest. I'm not trying to say that means anything more than that. So, fava beans, voting, elections. This isn't new. The Midnight Cry was first given in 2018 in Arkansas. Then it was repeated in France the next month, or 2 months after. At the end of that, or during that camp meeting in France, there were 2 question and answer sessions. In the first Q&A, there was a question from the floor regarding Fabius Maximus Gurgis, asking, well, what about Fabius? Because the emphasis was on Maximus Gurgis. The answer from Elder Tess was, I don't know. I'm sure it's significant, but I don't know. The end of the camp meeting, at the second Q&A, the question again came from the floor, what about Fabius? And Elder Tess said, they're fava beans. They're connected with voting. And so just for the record, I'm sharing with you today as just another member of the movement. I do not have a back door into Elder Tess's mind. We do not talk about these things, but I do remember her saying the connection between Fabius and voting back in 2018. So those thoughts have stayed with me, and now I'm sharing how those thoughts have developed over time. So Fabius, fava beans, broad beans, voting, elections. So I want to go back to a study that I shared in 2021 on voting. And I have tweaked it a little because of how things have changed, and I wanted to shorten it somewhat, although you'd never know. Let me share screen. We're going to have a little history on voting rights, in particular with the United States, because we want to know the truth of the fourth beast and we want to understand time. So this is connected with that. Voting rights in the United States has been a moral and political issue throughout its history. So we're going to be talking about voting rights. First of all, let's look at some board work. This line brings two thoughts together, the line of progression and the line of restoration. So we're going to start talking about rights in general. The line of progression gives us an external history. The line of restoration gives us the internal history. So we're comparing two thoughts on the one line. You can see the alpha and omega of ancient and modern Israel and how the modes of communication have developed and advanced from the written language carved in stone to the World Wide Web. That's the line of progression. We mark the invention of the printing press during the 1260 years as a great leap forward. So we can also see on this line the line of restoration. So the line of restoration is internal history. Line of progression, the modes of communication, external history. So the line of restoration is also progressive. The progression of humanity, Eden to Eden. And it has a chiastic structure. And the turning point occurs also in the middle of the 1260. So with the line of progression, we note a great leap forward in 1440 with the printing press. But I'd like to suggest that the turning point with the line of restoration is not the printing press, but it's the Magna Carta of 1215, 225 years earlier, the beginning of human rights. The Magna Carta is the dawn of democratic ideals. So here's a picture of one of the 4 remaining copies of the Magna Carta that I was able to take in 2012. I was visiting the south of England, and this is a copy in the Salisbury Cathedral in south of England. It's actually the day before I first met Elder Parminder. We were traveling down in that area. The full name was Magna Carta Libertatum, which is Latin for Great Charter of Freedoms. But it became simply known as the Magna Carta or Great Charter. It is one of the most important documents in history. It was written in 1215 to settle an intense political dispute between King John of England and a group of barons who were challenging King John's absolute right to rule. English barons, which were noblemen, stood up to King John and demanded that his authority exist within the rule of law. This meant that he could not punish his subjects unjustly or act arbitrarily outside the law. King John reluctantly signed the charter in order to maintain power. The terms of the charter were negotiated over the course of 3 days. When they reached agreement on June 15, 1215, the document was signed by the king and the barons at Runnymede outside of London. It established the principle that everyone is subject to the law, even the king, and guarantees the rights of individuals, the right to justice and the right to a fair trial. It's a super important document because this marks the first time the English people stepped up to limit the king's power and to assert their rights. So consequently, the Magna Carta is seen as foundational to human rights. So here are the 4 key principles. No one is above the law, not even the monarch. No one can be detained without cause or evidence. Everyone has a right to trial by jury. A widow cannot be forced to marry and give up her property. This is actually a major first step in women's rights. Women being very rich women, not all women. So within a week or so, it was actually annulled and it's been revised and it was purged of its more radical contents, but the primitive concepts became the beginnings of the rule of law. It wasn't, obviously it wasn't a document that protected the rights of the averaged Englishman. It only protected English barons and wealthy widows. But the concepts of individual rights and the limitations of governmental power had grown and were starting to mature. Magna Carta was the seed of those powerful concepts of freedom and constitutionally limited government. By the 17th and 18th centuries, those arguing for reforms and greater individual rights and protections used Magna Carta as their foundation. These ideas are at the very centre of both the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. So let's come down another 500 years and we are in the time of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment went for a good 130 years. It has 3 stages in that. It's also known as the Age of Reason. It was an intellectual and cultural movement in the 18th century that emphasized reason over superstition and science over blind faith. Using the power of the press, Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, Isaac Newton, and Voltaire questioned accepted knowledge and spread new ideas about openness, investigation, and religious tolerance throughout Europe and the Americas. Many consider the Enlightenment a major turning point in Western civilization, an age of light replacing an age of darkness. So the main idea of these Enlightenment philosophers were freedom and rights in government and religion. So here are 4 key philosophers. John Locke, he was the most influential. He established the principles that modern representative democracy are based on. That is, unalienable rights of life, liberty, and property. Unalienable means they're not transferable to another. You can't give them away and nobody can take them away or deny them from you. They are innate. Charles Montesquieu talked of the separation of powers in government, and he is the one that gave us the 3 branches: judicial, legislative, and executive. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he's famous for revising the social contract. So John Locke talked about a social contract. So social contract is, despite people having inalienable rights, they need to sacrifice some of their freedom in exchange for government protection of their lives, liberty, and property. And Locke called that agreement between a people and the government the social contract. Should a government deprive people of their rights by abusing its authority, the contract was broken and the people were no longer bound by its terms. Now, for Locke, withdrawing consent meant replacing one monarch with another. So if the contract was broken, for John Locke, you just got rid of that king and you got another king. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he argued against that. He said that monarchs were not divinely empowered to make laws, but only the general will of the people had the right to legislate. For only under the general will can the people be said to obey only themselves and hence be free. So yes, he spoke of equality in a society that can't exist under a king. You can't have a social contract with a king. So that's how he revised and improved the idea of a social contract that Locke gave us. Voltaire talked of social reform, separation of church and state, and freedom of speech. As progressive as these Enlightenment thinkers were, for example, Voltaire had a distrust of democracy. So they were progressive, but only to a certain extent. Voltaire believed that the average person was not capable of making proper decisions. But these thoughts of the Enlightenment had a profound effect on the French and the American Revolution and the democratic governments that they produced. So both revolutions, the French and the American, were fundamentally based on Enlightenment ideas. So we're going to come down to the American Revolution. It was an epic political and military struggle waged between 1775 and 1783, when 13 of Britain's North American colonies rejected its imperial rule. You can't have a social contract with a king. The protest began in opposition to taxes levied without colonial representation by the British monarchy and Parliament. So we come down to April 1970-75, the battles of Lexington and Concord. Whoop, typo. The shot heard around the world. So this is the shot that initiated the armed conflict between Britain and the 13 colonies, where 273 British deaths were recorded. So we mark this as a waymark in history. At this time, the Americans claimed that they sought only their rights within the British Empire. At that time, few of the colonists consciously desired to separate from Britain. But as the revolution continued over the next 12 months, the majority of Americans increasingly came to believe that they must secure their rights outside the empire. And this is basic Jean-Jacques Rousseau thinking. The social contract had been broken, and when any government usurps the power of the people, not only are the citizens no longer compelled to obey, they are also obligated to rebel. So 12 months after this, or sorry, more than 12, some months after the battle, the America declared itself to be independent. So this Declaration of Independence, it was not voted in, it's not legally binding. 56 people signed it, but it is a powerful document. Abraham Lincoln called it a rebuke and a stumbling block to tyranny and oppression. And one of the original purposes was to explain the colonists' right to revolution and to persuade the 13 colonies why it was necessary to revolt. In other words, they needed to declare the causes which impel them to separation. Just quoting it. Congress had to prove the legitimacy of its cause because it had just defied the most powerful nation on earth. So it's declared itself independent. In this declaration, there is no new thought. James Madison said the object of this declaration was to assert the truth, not to discover truth. So in the declaration, we'll read a little portion. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." So you recognize Lockean thought there. Locke said life, liberty, and property. The Declaration of Independence, or Thomas Jefferson said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because what is the pursuit of happiness? It's to get property. It's to, have stuff, have the freedom to own things. So how does it says governments are instituted among men, and they meant men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. So consent here is fundamental to social contract. It is a condition urged by many as a requirement for legitimate government. So the governed have to give their consent. The authority of a government should depend on the consent of the people as expressed by votes in elections. So the only way the people can consent is by voting in an election. But how would Americans consent to be governed? Who should vote? How should they vote? The founders really wrestled with these questions. They wondered about the rights of minorities. Now, in their day, that meant worrying about the rights of property owners, worrying that they might be overrun by the votes of those who did not own land. And James Madison described the problem this way. The right of suffrage is a fundamental article in Republican constitutions. What is suffrage? It is voting. We'll talk about that later. The regulation of it is, at the same time, a task of peculiar delicacy. Allow the right to vote exclusively to property owners, and the rights of persons may be oppressed. Extend it equally to all, and the rights of property owners may be overruled by a majority without property. So he says, see the problem? They really wrestled with this problem of who to give the right to vote to. He could see the problems both ways. Here's John Adamson. So this is 1787. Here's John Adams in 1787. If a majority were to control all branches of the government, debts would be abolished first, taxes laid heavy on the rich and not at all on the others, and at last a downright equal vision of everything would be demanded and voted. So what's the problem? You'd end up with equality. Now, this is actually what was happening in the states, the separate states, the 13 states, leading up or during these continental congresses, is the states were implementing populist ideas, and they were taxing the rich and abolishing debts. They were, yes, they were listening to the voice of the people, actually, but it wasn't done very wisely, and it would end in financial crisis. So the founders really struggled with this idea of how can we protect minority rights and yet still have majority rule. And that's the tension that has been in democracy from the beginning. So when you think of the original democracy as it was in Greece, that was mob rule, and it ended in disaster. So there needed to be checks and balances to protect minorities from mob rule. So we're going to have a look at the history of voting rights in the United States, because it's been a long and difficult path. We'll walk through some of the basic documents. So here's the Constitution of the United States, March 4, 1789. At the time of founding, when the Constitution was written, very few people were given the right to vote. For nearly the first century of its existence, only white males over the age of 21, and in many states, only white land-owning men over the age of 21 could vote. So you had to be white, that's racism. You had to be male, that's sexism. You had to have property, you had to be a property owner, which was economic or classism. Therefore, the majority of people were not represented. In fact, in the first election, the election that elected George Washington, only 6% of the population voted for that, were eligible to vote for that election. And actually even fewer than that when you think that they had to go through the college, the Electoral College. So in the Constitution, there's no right to vote in it. The Constitution guarantees many rights, including the right to free speech and freedom of religion. But as it existed in 1788, and it was ratified in 1789, and as it exists today in 2024 with its 27 amendments, it still doesn't contain an express right to vote. But while lacking this guarantee, it does say a lot about voting, with the word vote appearing more than 40 times. So where does this leave voting rights? Did the founding fathers forget to write about it, forget that people would have the right to vote? It might seem that way, but they, like I said, they were really wrestling with this. And so why did it end up not being in the Constitution? First of all, there's going to be a battle to ratify this Constitution. It has to be approved by the states. And at that time, you had two different camps. You had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So the Federalists were all for uniting the states and coming under a federal government. And you had the Anti-Federalists who just wanted to keep the states separate. So the Anti-Federalists opposed the adoption of the US Constitution. Anti-Federalists demanded that the power of voting should largely remain with the states and not with the federal government. So can't really say that the Constitution compromised on this issue. They didn't compromise, they actually just conceded. They just said, okay, and they gave the states the power to manage the elections. But it also allowed the Congress the right to step in if needed. So we'll go to Article 1, Section 4 on elections. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. So the Constitution compromised on the issue or conceded. It gave the states the power to manage elections, but it also allowed Congress to step in if needed. So this is one of a few concessions that had to be made in order to get the Constitution ratified. The second reason that voting rights aren't in the constitutions is they never actually thought that the states would ever deny its citizens the right to vote, because that would be a denial of a republican form of government. And that's why this guarantee clause is in here. It opens the door for federal intervention just in case the states did do that. But they never really believed that a state would dare to deny its citizens the right to vote, because the founders saw voting, at least for white males, so central to the very idea of America that they just didn't think the states would ever do that. Unfortunately, that the leaving of election control to individual states led to a lot of unfair voting practices in the United States. So at first, white men with property were the only Americans routinely permitted to vote. And then eventually non-property owners were allowed to vote. By about 1860, most white men without property were enfranchised. But African Americans, women, Native Americans, non-English speakers, and citizens between the ages of 18 and 21 had to fight for the right to vote in the United States. So we'll just digress here and we'll ask the question, what kind of government does the United States have? And it actually is a democratic republic. So if I was to say, hold up a picture of an apple, and I asked you what it was, and somebody said it's an apple, it wouldn't be wrong, but it wouldn't be the whole story, because it could be a Granny Smith apple, it might be a Pink Lady apple. There are many, many types of apples. So to say that the United States is a democracy, it's not wrong, but it's not really not entirely correct. So in a democratic republic, citizens are empowered to participate in representational political system. In both a republic and a democracy, citizens are empowered to participate in representational political system. They elect people to represent and protect their interests in how the government functions. So the United States, like most modern nations, it's neither a pure republic or a pure democracy. It's a hybrid. And the main difference is the extent to which people control the process of making laws under each form of government. Because we might think that majority rule is a good idea. But what about periods when the majority are racist or homophobic or patriarchal? Do you want that majority suppressing the rights of the minorities? And this is the fundamental tension in a democracy. How to protect majority rule, but do so in the way that the majority protects the minority rights. So what the founding fathers did is they created institutions like the Electoral College, which prevented the direct election of a president, and the Senate, that gave equal representation to the states with the large populations and those with small ones. And they also compromised to give the South a disproportionate say. That's the 2/3 compromise. They created those three institutions, the Electoral College, the Senate, and the 2/5 compromise. 2/5 compromise. They were all concessions so that they could get the Constitution ratified. So these three institutions were actually created to be a check on democracy. The key institution that restrains majority rule is the Senate. So back in the day, when they were trying to organize how it would all work, and the Senate, the founding fathers actually wanted proportionate representation. That meant if you were a state like Virginia was at the time with the largest population, you would have the largest representation. Whereas a state like Delaware, smallest population, smallest representation. And what Delaware said was, if you don't give us the same amount of representatives as the large states, we're leaving. We'll join France. Now, this is like just 10 years after the revolution, and you've got small states threatening to join up with, other countries. It was, there was quite a crisis. So that's why they said, okay, the large states will have 2 senators, the small states will have 2 senators. And so what you have today is you have California with a very large, very diverse demographic, 67 times greater population than, say, Wyoming, and it has 2 senators, and Wyoming has 2 senators, which is a largely white, rural-based demographic. These are institutions that were placed to actually put a check on majority rule. So again, when I say that the founding fathers were considering minority rights, the minority that they're actually considering were themselves, because white property owners, male property owners, were actually a minority. White male landowners. And even the southern states, the slaveholders were minorities. So by them getting the 3/5 compromise, and I'm just going to assume you understand the 3/5 compromise because it's been talked about in the movement before. If not, go Google it. It gave them equal representation where they wouldn't have had ordinarily. This has had really consequential effects today. When we think of the protection of minority rights, we think of the protection of vulnerable minorities, disenfranchised and persecuted people. But like I said, the founding fathers were concerned about a privileged minority group, basically themselves. And what we see right now is that same kind of thing, where a privileged, conservative, sexist white minority is trying to suppress the power of a much more diverse, multiracial governing majority. And that's the very dangerous situation to the American democracy today. A prime example is the Supreme Court. For the first time in history, US history, 5 of the 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court were appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote initially and were confirmed by senators representing a minority of Americans. So the Supreme Court is a product of minority rule, not majority rule. It's a product of 2 skewed institutions, the Electoral College and the appointment of US senators. And they're flawed institutions because they violate one person, one vote principle. So we might just leave that there for time. You know, just on another thought, this is one of the problems with originalism. Because if you go back in time, you have to recognize that James Madison and many of the other prominent framers were very unhappy with the concessions that had to be made to ratify that Constitution. They weren't happy with the way the Senate, they weren't happy with the Electoral College, they weren't happy with the 3/5 compromise. They were concessions to get it ratified, but they saw where the problems where that could head. They wanted an elite body. They were concerned about themselves as a minority, but they could also see where it would head to a United States being undemocratic. So the Constitution really was ratified to check democracy, but it shouldn't have stayed like that. If it was a living document, there should have been, and as there were, amendments made to actually expand the vote. Okay, better move on. Let's come down. We'll look at one more and then we'll close. 1863. We mark that on our line, Acts 27. This is where the ship goes off course. So 1863 is a turning point in the Civil War. We come to January 1, where the government gave the Emancipation Proclamation. This proclamation was a presidential order and wasn't a law passed by Congress. So Lincoln pushed it. He was pushing for an anti-slavery amendment to the US Constitution, but that was going to come later. This proclamation was really just to unify and strengthen his party, to help them stay in power for the next 2 decades. So we'll read a portion from the Emancipation Proclamation. So it was written in 1862, but it came into effect in January 1, 1863. That on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. So what we want to note here is that it gives responsibility to the federal forces to maintain freedom, the freedom of the unenslaved people. So the responsibility would be on the federal forces. Now later, so that this comes into effect beginning of 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg is the turning point in the Civil War. That's July. And then later in the year, in December, we see Abraham Lincoln is going to give the Gettysburg Address. He's dedicating a cemetery to the soldiers that have died in the war so far in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And on the afternoon of November 19, he gives this Gettysburg Address. And oh, sorry, I've skipped. Here it is. 67 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So thousands of soldiers fell at Gettysburg so that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. And presumably, a government of and by the people was one that the people selected. What people? All the people that are created equal. So the only way that a government can be of the people is by fair and free voting in elections. In 1865, the Civil War is over, and we're going to see the beginning of the era of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 laid out the process for readmitting Southern states into the Union. Its main focus was to bring the Southern states back into full political participation in the Union, guaranteeing rights to former slaves and defining new relationships between African Americans and whites. So this would require 3 important amendments to the Constitution. So in 1865, the 13th Amendment would abolish slavery. In 1865, again, the 14th Amendment grants citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former enslaved people, and it guarantees all citizens equal protection of the law. And then the 15th Amendment. The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, colour, or previous condition of servitude. So these are the words of the 15th Amendment, and Congress is going to take immediate action. And in the 1870s, it's going to pass what is called the Enforcement Acts. And it's going to give the federal government oversight to make sure that African Americans can vote. And there's going to be this 10-year period of Reconstruction, which was really a golden age. Federal troops went into the South, and because of their presence in the South, because of the enforcement of this 15th Amendment, there were black senators from Mississippi that were voted in. There were black governors from Louisiana. It was an amazing, brief 10-year period. So we'll stop here for time and we'll come back and we'll look at what happens at the end of this era of Reconstruction and how voting rights went backwards and what had to be done. So just a reminder that we're looking at voting rights because we've gone back to our lines of Acts 27. We've noticed Sunday law is symbolized by Fabius Maximus Gurgis, and we've noticed that Fabius is fava beans, which are used in voting and elections. So we're looking at the history of voting rights in the glorious land. So I invite you to kneel with me in prayer. Dear God in heaven, we thank you that there have been events external to the church where people have seen the issues of protecting human rights. We would understand how that relates to us and how we are to see external events today and how that affects our line of restoration from Eden to Eden. So please help us to understand what is necessary, to put aside what is not, and to see how your character is to be seen in people and how we are to treat each other. So we ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.